Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast. This week's episode is Speaking of Change. Maybe a subtitle would be Getting Started with a Very Big Topic. A couple of things to consider as we think about how leaders can talk about change and create change in their organizations. I'm going to think through some of the foundational ideas in this episode. I'll be exploring this again in later episodes because like I said, it's a very, very big topic, and I can't begin to cover everything you need to know about change communication in one 10 or 12-minute episode. For today, though, let's start with some foundational ideas. One of the activities I often do in a workshop environment with new leaders is to have them reflect on what they think about or they feel when a change is brought to them. Not a change that they're driving themselves, rather a change that's brought to them that they then must implement. Primarily, I hear things like, well, why are we doing this? Or if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or who made this decision? When is this necessary? Why is this necessary? What's driving this change? Lots and lots of questions, some negative, some neutral, some positive. And then as we discuss this whole idea of responses to change being some negative, some neutral, some positive, we come to the conclusion that whether something is negative, neutral, or positive is really the emotion attached to it, not the fact. For example, in some cases, I'll hear people raise the question, why? And one person might say that's a neutral question. Another person might say that's a negative question. Same question, different responses or different emotions attached to it. And so when we start thinking through that idea, it becomes clear that the thing we have to deal with in helping other people, and often even helping ourselves deal with change, is the whole emotionality of the change. And I often say that facts drive the need for change, yet emotions limit the acceptance or implementation of it. I'll say that again. Facts can drive the need for change. Emotions can limit the acceptance or implementation of it. And the reason this is so important to understand is that if we're trying to help people deal with a change that may be driven by facts, for example, customer demand changed, regulatory environment changed, something changed in market forces, technology changed, new software came available, any of these kind of things that are just factual events that drive our decision to implement a change. And yet it's our emotion in response to these facts that makes it difficult for us to accept or embrace them. As I think about this issue of facts versus emotion, I'm reminded of an interchange I had with my wife a number of years ago. It was actually several years ago, probably more than 15 years ago, as we were discussing an issue that was present in the relationship of one of our married couple friends. And I said these very wise and thoughtful words. Honey, let's set the emotions aside and look at the facts. To which she looked at me sort of dumbfounded and surprised and said, did you hear yourself? Thought about for a minute, what are you saying? And she said, we're talking about a relationship. It is by nature emotional. You can't set emotions aside. And I honestly had to acknowledge, you're right. When we're talking about an emotional issue, you can't set emotions aside. Well, that's something to consider in change communication also. It is an emotional issue, and you can't set emotions aside. In fact, you will rarely win the day in an emotional discussion by trying to persuade the other person with facts. At some level, as leaders, we have to get very comfortable with wading into an emotional world and navigating through that emotional world with other people in order to get to the other side of acceptance. And then we have to think about the idea of what is acceptance and what is resistance. And it's often said, I hear many people say this, that people resist change. And I think if you'll think about your own life and look at the things you have changed, you change hairstyles, you change food preferences, you change the way you drive to work. There are all kinds of things we change each and every day. Different people to different extremes. And all of us at some level change something in our lives when we have control over it. So to say that people resist change is not completely accurate. It's more accurate to say that people don't really resist change. They resist being changed or having change forced on them from an outside source. And it really gets down to this whole emotional reaction piece. That facts may be driving the need for change and emotions affect our acceptance or implementation of the change. And when we feel like another person or an outside force is trying to make us change, we naturally resist it because it wasn't our choice and it triggers negative emotions. Another thing to consider about change is it's sort of like a grieving process. It's not a perfect analogy, although it's a close enough analogy to kind of wrap our head around how things work. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross proposed the 5 stages of grief in the 1960s, and there's been lots of discussion in the popular press, actually lots of criticism and comment in the psychological world, psychological circles, I should say, about whether the 5 stages of grief are valid or not valid, or if it's really a linear progression as it first appeared in Kubler-Ross's initial work. And later in life, she said that she didn't even actually think it was a perfectly linear process and that every person experiences every stage. So the 5 stages of grief is not a perfect analogy because even in the world of grief research, it's not completely accepted. Let's use it as kind of a guideline, though, to think about how people embrace change. So the 5 stages of grief, as proposed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her initial work, was denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. When we look at change as a similar, not identical, similar process, you can see that people tend to first deny a change, then resist it, then explore the options, and then finally come to acceptance. And like the 5 stages of grief, that might not be a perfectly linear process, and it might not be that every person goes through all 4 stages. It is helpful and informative to understand that these are some of the emotional responses people have. They first, or I shouldn't say first, often will deny the need for the change. They don't see why the change is necessary. And moving along a little bit, we might get to actually actively resisting it. And when we've come to understand the need for the change and dealt with our initial emotions, maybe we're willing to explore ways to implement it even though we don't like it, and finally get to a place of acceptance. Not a perfectly linear process. Some people may skip steps. Some people may go in a circular fashion. They go deny, resist, explore, deny, resist, explore, deny, resist, explore, then accept. It's not a perfect analogy. It just helps us frame some of the emotional context we have to deal with. Now, what's the point of all this? As a leader, if you want to help people buy into change more quickly and more effectively, you have to first embrace the idea that it's emotional, it has different stages, it's messy, it's complex, and not everyone is going to do it exactly the same way. One overriding thought to consider is that if you want other people to buy into a change, you have to resist the temptation to try to force them to change, and you have to wade into and understand the emotional context they're dealing with. So basically, if you want to get buy-in, you have to understand that buy is part of buy-in, which means you must sell. And in order to sell, here are a few things to think about. If you want to sell a change, you want to focus more on questions and less on statements. More questions, less statements. The goal of questions is to uncover the emotional barriers other people have to overcome in order to embrace and accept the change. And as you're asking questions, you want to make sure you listen more and speak less. Listening helps you hear the real reason the person is resistant to a change or frustrated by a change or upset by a change. Until you understand their emotional barriers, you won't be able to navigate through those barriers or over those barriers or help the person come to the other side of those barriers. And the key is not to push them through the barriers. It is to help them overcome the barriers, which means you need to focus more on selling than on driving. Or language that we use in the Kevin Eikenberry group is championing the change rather than forcing or making the change. You're trying to find the emotional barriers, find the hooks that would help the other person find their emotional reasons, not their factual reasons for buying into the change, feeling like they were forced, Rather, they're emotional reasons. It's a conversational process where you're navigating the process together so that together you arrive on the other side of change acceptance. Then you want to give people time. You have to build time into the process. Remember that people are not likely to buy a change the first time you talk about it. You may have to visit this subject several times and listen to them and share more information and ask more questions. It's going to take some time. If you try to do it too quickly, it will feel like people are being forced. And when they feel like they're forced, they will naturally resist. So the key to getting buy-in, or some of the keys to think about, like I said, we'll explore this later in future episodes. To get buy-in, you need to sell change, which means more questions and less statements. Listen more, speak less, sell rather than drive, and give people time. Now, this episode just begins to scratch the surface of all the variables and subtleties to consider as you sell change and help other people navigate through the change process. We're going to explore more of that in future episodes. For now, remember, more questions, less statements, listen more, speak less, more selling, less driving, and give people time. If you'll do that, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.